4, 3, 2, 1.
Silverwing. Douglas light gazing out of the window, especially now it was autumn. He sat on the old wooden chest that once had belonged to his mother and now was his, and he looked out over the fields. Everyone else hated this time of year, the last bit of autumn. They moaned about it and wished it would be over. He, however, saw a beautiful, mysterious world. The fields were filled with shallow ditches of water that reflected the grey sky. The far trees were almost invisible through the mist. Up above them, the low hills were grey too. Douglas could only just make out their outlines. It was true that everything was shades of grey, but it was not true that it was boring and miserable. This was the most magical bit of the whole year, when anything might happen. At night, the great winds came and shook the skies and woods. It felt as if the house might take off. Sometimes he woke in the night and didn't want to go back to sleep. It felt as if he was in some great ship. His cabin rocked from side to side in the storm, buffeted by the strong winds. "Can you get in some coal?" He was pulled from his dreaming by his father's voice. He turned round, but his father had gone already, so he didn't answer. He didn't want to go, but he knew he'd better all the same. He padded down the wooden stairs and put on his boots in the porch, picked up the bucket. Outside, he recognized a familiar sound as his feet crunched on the gravel to go round the side of the house. One single call, then others. He looked up, but could see nothing yet. It was the geese. The geese had come back from Iceland. They were migrant birds. They left in the spring, spent the summer there, and returned before the winter snows fell in Iceland. That's the first page of my new novel for 8 to 12-year-olds, Silverwing, which was published 2-3 weeks ago by Name Tree Press in London. And it's, what will I say? What is it about? To give a background to that, because the first page doesn't give an awful lot away, but to give a little bit more of a sense of it, which is important, obviously, it's about a father and son coming to terms very slowly with the loss of the mum and the wife they loved so dearly, who has died from cancer the year before. And what happens is, I give a mention of that at the tail end of that first page. I mentioned the geese coming back from Iceland, and there in the late autumn. Douglas goes out one day, this particular day, as he goes out to get the coal, and he finds an injured greylag goose lying in the field beside the house where he and his dad live. And he brings that goose back to the house and slowly tries to nurse the goose back to health. What happens too is that over the coming weeks and months, he and his dad together find various things. I'm not going to give this away, but they find various things, exciting things, that tell them far more about the mother and wife that they lost than they ever knew before. And so it's a journey really from absolute shadow and sadness to the beginnings of light and hope. That's as much of the story, I think, as I'm going to give away. What's the background to it in personal terms? Well, I myself grew up. I'm fortunate enough to be here with my wife on the west coast of Scotland, on the Isle of Seil. I spent my early formative years in Perthshire, on the edge of Highland Perthshire. And I grew up with a dad who was a fanatical bird watcher. And one of the things that we watched for, that I learned to watch for, were the greylag geese. Irony is that they're all around us here on the island. They're almost here every day, especially once they're back from Iceland in the late autumn, as they were for Douglas that day at the start of the novel. So I have to root things in what I know, and certainly for the novel, in that respect, I was writing about what I knew, because I've observed greylag geese since childhood in Highland Perthshire. Not quite as close up as Douglas is experiencing them when he finds Silverwing and begins to nurse Silverwing back to health, but pretty close, pretty close. I think I wanted to set myself a challenge with this novel. I've written quite a lot of books for 8 to 12-year-olds before, and I think in comparison they were easy journeys. There was nothing terribly difficult about them. Here, I deliberately, I have to deal with the ideas that come to me, that are given to me. And that was a story that landed with me one day. Here's a boy and his dad on the edge of incredible sadness and grief. They're still recovering from the loss of, well, Douglas's mum, his dad's wife. And that was my challenge to myself. Write that story. A goose is going to come into this and is going to bring something wonderful. But write that story. So it was almost a journey upwards from nowhere. A journey from darkness and despair at the bottom of the pit, and a slow path upwards into the beginning, the possibility of light. That was the challenge to myself. And there has to be, for any writer, a challenge in the writing. Otherwise, for me, it's pointless. Who's it aimed at? Well, it's very much I would say, I know that this is a terrible cliche, but I would say that it's for children of all ages. Quite a lot of the feedback that I've had thus far on Silverwing has been as much from adults as from children. Probably more from adults. So I think I love writing for this age range because I'm very aware of the child within. There's something still that I can tap within myself that's childlike, and that remembers what it was like to be 8, 9, 10 years old and in that part of Scotland growing up. And the joy of the geese and the joy of the autumn. There's quite a good deal of me in the character of Douglas. The story is, I don't think there's anything that I have taken from, that came to me from nowhere. And the premise was completely made up. So nothing of the characters, nothing of the story behind it is really, of course, there are plenty. I wanted deliberately to deal with bereavement and to pick on that, but the story itself was completely invented. I've never yet come across anybody who has managed to nurse a greylag goose back to health. So it's a story that's entirely invented. What do I want to do with it? What do I want to see happening with it? Well, I think my real, and this is not said for my great benefit, but I really want, it goes without saying, any writer wants their work to be read. What I would love to do is to work with this book in schools. In Scotland through Scottish Book Trust, in England through other organisations. I would love to be leading workshops and talks in schools, discussing the issues behind it, because I think that that's really important. I think it's a book that needs to be guided, probably. And of course there will be many teachers who can do that just as adequately, but it will be a great privilege to work with Silverwing in schools and to give readings from it. It's a book that's now available very much through the Waterstones chain, and it will be in other independent bookshops as well, of course, these days as on the net. And I just would ask you to look for it, to look for Silverwing, and to pass on word of it, because I feel it's an important story. Thank you, and I look forward to seeing you next time.